Many thanks to Nav, Jerb, Scale Speed Gaming and Devotan for making this video possible. Broken Bones are back in DayZ, and with it comes the infamous bone stat, but this time round the bone stat has a level of detail that makes the old bone stat look like it came straight out of Fortnite. So in this video I'm going to be breaking down how the bone stat works and answering loads of questions that I'm sure you all have. The bone stat is like any other stat in DayZ, but is assigned to a body part instead of the whole body. The body parts in the game files are the right and left arm and hands, right and left legs and feet, and the torso. However, as of 1.10, only the bone stat for legs are in the game. When you take brute force damage to a body part with this bone stat, the bone stat deteriorates at the rate that corresponds with how much health damage you took. So if you take about 50% health damage as a result of a fall, you take around 50% bone stat damage too, but more testing is needed to know the exact numbers at play here. What I do know is that the lower this bone stat becomes, the more chance you have of getting a fracture from a fall, as shown by dropping several times from the same small height with consistent results. When a fracture does occur, you will get this broken bone icon and will be forced into the prone position if you have room to go prone. If you try to walk or even crouch walk, you will take shock damage depending on the severity of the fracture, going unconscious very quickly. The leg bone stat has around 100 health and is split into 3 levels of severity. Low severity is between 100 and 80, medium is between 80 and 20, and high severity is between 20 and 0. From testing, you are most likely always going to go straight into high severity when you get a fracture. At low severity, you would take 4 shock damage a step, at medium 6 shock damage a step, and at high 8 shock damage each step. Now listen carefully to this part. Be aware that if you are standing or crouched while you have a fracture, your shock stat will not regenerate. The only way to regenerate it is to go prone. Now Codeine Tablets increase how many steps you can take by 25%, and morphine increases how many steps you can take by 50%. They have no other uses against fractures, unlike the previous bone stat, so I'd say they're not really worth using. This is because you can just make a splint to allow you to walk unlimited steps, which is made from 4 rags and 2 wooden sticks. With this splint attached, you can run without taking shock damage but cannot sprint or jump, but you can still vault over small things like fences. Also, with the splint attached, it is impossible to receive another fracture, so it kind of protects you from fractures too. But before you think you can attach one of these before you go into battle with somebody, or jumping off a high place, you can't attach a splint to yourself unless you have a fracture. Now repairing a fracture is very difficult. You will need a minimum of 2500 water and a minimum of 4000 energy, and you will need to be at full blood and full health. So before the healing of the fracture even starts, you will need to wait for your health and your blood damage to regenerate, which you took from getting the fracture in the first place, meaning you have to wait a minimum of 1 hour if your stats are above these minimum levels. When you do meet these requirements, it would take roughly 35 minutes to repair a high severity fracture. However, this is with a splint. Without a splint, it appears to take twice as long at 71 minutes. So you can repair a fracture without a splint, but it appears to take twice as long pending further tests. This means making a splint as soon as possible is highly recommended. But before you think you should always carry around a splint on you, it's not small at 2x4 slots, so just make sure you always have 4 rags on you at all times, because you can get 2 sticks from a bush nearby without any tools. Don't walk to the bush, don't crawl to the bush, roll to the bush, it's much faster. Again, I want you to listen carefully here. If you don't have 4 rags on you and you get a fracture, then you will probably die if you don't have a gun, because you will need to get those rags from rolling around a town searching for them, and towns have infected, which will be nearly impossible to fight without a gun. This is because you take 20 shock damage every time you do a light attack when you have a fracture, and 35 shock damage with heavy attacks. So in 4 light attacks you go unconscious, and just 3 heavy attacks you will go unconscious. However, the worst part of having a fracture around infected is that every time they hit you, you fall to the floor. So even the best melee weapons in the game won't help you much here. This makes having 4 rags on you at all times imperative in DayZ now, marking the beginning of the 4 rag meta. Now bandages can be used to make splints too, but you will need 4 charges of a bandage to use it on 2 sticks. But rope and wire won't work to make splints. Being WOBO, I just had to set up an experiment to test the chances of getting a fracture. Each step here represents 1 meter, so this is 15 meters tall or 15 steps. At 1 and 2 meters I took no damage, but at 3 meters I did, and if you spam jump off of 3 meters you will get a fracture after 5 to 7 jumps, unless you rest between jumps, which means the bone stat we talked about earlier regenerates on its own, and it appears to regenerate quickly, which means there is no such thing as a woe bone that comes with this version of the stat, because it regenerates on its own. Anyway, the higher I went up this staircase, the more health damage I took until I died at 15 meters, or the 15th step. As I fell from greater heights, the more shock damage I took too, being unconscious for as much as 55 seconds at 14 meters. However, while the bone stat damage increased as I went higher, there were some occasions where no fracture occurred at all, even at 14 meters, which means even if the bone stat is brutally damaged, there is a chance of no fracture at all. Whether this is intended or not is yet to be seen. Moving on, and upon further testing, because I had loads of questions about this stat, what you land on doesn't make a difference when it comes to fracture chance, but jumping into water will cause no fracture damage or even any health damage or any damage at all. The type of shoes you wear or the quality level of the shoes makes no difference either, which also means wearing no shoes at all makes no difference to damage here. Grenades and landmines don't cause bone damage, but the bear trap does. It will instantly, 100% of the time, cause a fracture to players, but it doesn't on animals. Even when animals bug out and they go crazy high in the air like it did here, it just lands like nothing even happened. Jumping out of a moving car will cause a lot of shock damage and a lot of health damage, but there's no chance of getting a fracture yet. Jumping out of a car at 20 or more kilometers an hour would make you go unconscious and give you 1 bleed source, and jumping out of a car at 35 or higher is instant death from health damage. But if you do have a fracture, you can still drive a car, even without a splint. If after getting a fracture you decide a swim might be a pleasant way to spend your time, think again, because you would take a lot of shock damage from swimming, go unconscious, and then you would drown to death. Climbing ladders is much the same. You will climb up, take shock damage as you move, fall unconscious, and then fall to your death. So basically, when you have a fracture, you will die from pretty much everything unless you make a splint. So keep those 4 rags or 1 full bandage on you at all times, unless rolling is your preferred method of travel. Now I will be testing this further on stream because I want to know how the bone stat works with PvP. You can find those results in the comments, and that's also where I want you to go, to the comments, to give your feedback on this mechanic. I'm sure the devs will be reading to see what the community thinks, to tweak this a little bit, so please post your stance on fractures and how it works in DayZ below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to have a good day.